Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Today, I'll be reading another essay from Arthur Schopenhauer. This one is titled, On Philosophy and the Intellect. Thanks for listening. The fundament upon which all of our knowledge and learning rests is the inexplicable. It is to this that every explanation, through few or many intermediate stages, leads, as the plummet touches the bottom of the sea now at a greater depth, now at a less, but is bound to reach it somewhere sooner or later. The study of this inexplicable devolves upon metaphysics. For intellect in the service of the will, that is to say, in practical use, there exist only individual things. For intellect engaged in art and science, that is to say, for its own sake, there exist only universals, entire kinds, species, classes, ideas of things. Even the sculptor, in depicting the individual, seeks to depict the idea, the species. The reason for this is that the will aims directly only at individual things, which are its true objective, for only they possess empirical reality. Concepts, classes, kinds, on the other hand, can become its objective only very indirectly. That is why the ordinary man has no sense for general truths, and why the genius, on the contrary, overlooks and neglects what is individual. To the genius, the enforced occupation with the individual as such, which constitutes the stuff of practical life, is a burdensome drudgery. The two main requirements for philosophizing are, firstly, to have the courage not to keep any question back, and secondly, to attain a clear consciousness of anything that goes without saying, so as to comprehend it as a problem. Finally, the mind must, if it is really to philosophize, also be truly disengaged. It must prosecute no particular goal or aim, and thus be free from the enticement of will, but devote itself undividedly to the instruction which the perceptible world and its own consciousness imparts to it. The poet presents the imagination with images from life and human characters and situations, sets them all in motion, and leaves it to the beholder to let these images take his thoughts as far as his mental powers will permit. That is why he is able to engage men of the most differing capabilities, indeed fools and sages together. The philosopher, on the other hand, presents not life itself, but the finished thoughts which he has abstracted from it, and then demands that the reader should think precisely as, and precisely as far as, he himself thinks. That is why his public is so small. The poet can thus be compared with one who presents flowers, the philosopher with one who presents their essence. An odd and unworthy definition of philosophy, which, however, even Kant gives, is that it is a science composed only of concepts, for the entire property of a concept consists of nothing more than what has been begged and borrowed from perceptual knowledge, which is the true and inexhaustible source of all insight. So that a true philosophy cannot be spun out of mere abstract concepts, but has to be founded on observation and experience, inner and outer. Nor will anything worthwhile be achieved in philosophy by synthesizing experiments with concepts such as have been performed so often in the past, but especially by the sophists of our own day, and I mean by Fichte and Schelling, and even more offensively by Hegel, and in the field of ethics by Schleiermacher. Philosophy, just as much as art and poetry, must have its source in perceptual comprehension of the world. Nor, however, much the head needs to remain on top, ought it to be so cold-blooded a business that the whole man, heart and head, is not finally involved and affected through and through. Philosophy is not algebra. On the contrary, Vauvenargues was right when he said, Les grandes pensées viennent du cœur, which, in English, means, great thoughts come from the heart. Mere subtlety may qualify you as a skeptic, but not as a philosopher. On the other hand, skepticism is in philosophy what the opposition is in Parliament. It is just as beneficial, and indeed necessary. It rests everywhere on the fact that philosophy is not capable of producing the kind of evidence that mathematics produces. A dictate of reason is the name we give to certain propositions which we hold true without investigation, and of which we think ourselves so firmly convinced that we should be incapable of seriously testing them, even if we wanted to, since we should then have to call them provisionally in doubt. We credit these propositions so completely because when we first begin to speak and to think, we continually had them recited to us, and they were thus implanted in us, so that the habit of thinking them is as old as the habit of thinking as such, and we can no longer separate the two. People never weary of reproaching metaphysics with the very small progress it has made compared with the very great progress of the physical sciences. But what other science has been hampered at all times by having an antagonist ex officio, a public prosecutor, a king's champion in full armor against it? Metaphysics will never put forth its full powers so long as it is expected to accommodate itself to dogma. The various religions have taken possession of the metaphysical tendency of mankind, partly by paralyzing it through imprinting their dogmas upon it in the earliest years, and partly by forbidding and prescribing all free and uninhibited expression of it, so that free investigation of man's most important and interesting concern, of his existence itself, has been in part indirectly hampered, in part made subjectively impossible by the paralysis referred to, and in this way his most sublime tendency has been put in chains. The discovery of truth is prevented most effectively, not by the false appearance of things present, and which mislead into error, nor directly by weakness of the reasoning powers, but by preconceived opinion, by prejudice, which as a pseudo a priori stands in the path of truth, and is then like a contrary wind driving a ship away from the land, so that sail and rudder labor in vain. Every general truth is related to specific truths as gold is to silver, inasmuch as it can be converted into a considerable number of specific truths, which follow from it in the same way as a gold coin can be converted into small change. From one proposition, nothing more can follow than what is already contained in it, that is, than what it itself implies when its meaning is exhausted. But from two propositions, if they are joined together as the premises of a syllogism, more can follow than is contained in either of them taken individually, just as a body formed by chemical combination exhibits qualities possessed by none of its constituents. That logical conclusion possesses value derives from this fact. What light is to the outer physical world, intellect is to the inner world of consciousness, for intellect is related to will, and thus also to the organism, which is nothing other than will regarded objectively, in approximately the same way as light is to a combustible body, and the oxygen in combination with which it ignites. And as light is the purer, the less it is involved with the smoke of the burning body, so also is intellect the purer, the more completely it is separated from the will which engendered it. In a bolder metaphor, one could even say, life is known to be a process of combustion. Intellect is the light produced by this process. The simplest, unprejudiced self-observation, combined with the facts of anatomy, leads to the conclusion that intellect, like its objectivization, the brain, is, together with its dependent sense apparatus, nothing other than a very intense receptivity to influences from without, and does not constitute our original and intrinsic being. Thus, that intellect is not that in us which in a plant is motive power, or in a stone weight and chemical forces. It is will alone which appears in these forms. Intellect is that in us which in a plant is merely receptivity to external influences, to physical and chemical action, and whatever else may help or hinder it to grow and thrive. But in us, this receptivity has risen to such a pitch of intensity that by virtue of it the entire objective world, the world as idea, appears, and this, consequently, is how its objectivization originates. It will help to make all this more vivid if you imagine the world without any animal life on it. Then there will be nothing on it capable of perceiving it, and therefore it will actually have no objective existence at all. Now imagine a number of plants shooting up out of the ground close beside one another. All of kinds of things will begin to operate on them, such as air, wind, the pressure of one plant against another, moisture, cold, light, warmth, electricity, etc. Now, imagine the receptivity of these plants to influences of this kind intensified more and more. It will finally become sensation, accompanied by the capacity to refer sensation to its cause, and at last perception, whereupon the world will be there, appearing in space, time, and causal connection, yet it will still be merely the result of external influences on the receptivity of the plants. This pictorial representation brings home very well the merely phenomenal existence of the external world, and makes it comprehensible, for no one, surely, would care to assert that a state of affairs which consists of perceptions originating in nothing, but relations between external influences and active receptivity, represents the truly objective, inner, and original constitution of all those natural forces assumed to be acting on the plants, that it represents, that is to say, the world of things in themselves. This picture can thus make it comprehensible to us why the realm of the human intellect should have such narrow boundaries, as Kant demonstrates it has in the Critique of Pure Reason. That you should write down valuable ideas that occur to you as soon as possible goes without saying. We sometimes forget even what we have done, so how much more what we have thought. Thoughts, however, come not when we, but when they want. On the other hand, it is better not to copy down what we have received finished and complete from without, what we have merely learned, and what can, in any case, be discovered again in books. For to copy something down is to consign it to forgetfulness. You should deal sternly and despotically with your memory, so that it does not unlearn obedience. If, for example, you cannot call something to mind, a line of poetry or a word perhaps, you should not go out and look it up in a book, but periodically plague your memory with it for weeks on end, until your memory has done its duty. For the longer you have had to rack your brains for something, the more firmly will it stay once you have got it. The quality of our thoughts, their formal value, comes from within, their direction, and thus their matter, from without, so that what we are thinking at any given moment is the product of two fundamentally different factors. Consequently, the object of thought is to the mind only what the plectrum is to the lyre, which is why the same sight inspires such very different thoughts in differing heads. How very paltry and limited the normal human intellect is, and how little lucidity there is in the human consciousness, may be judged from the fact that, despite the ephemeral brevity of human life, the uncertainty of our existence, and the countless enigmas which press upon us from all sides, everyone does not continually and ceaselessly philosophize, but that only the rarest of exceptions do so. The rest live their lives away in this dream not very differently from the animals, from which they are, in the end, distinguished only by their ability to provide for a few years ahead. If they should ever feel any metaphysical need, it is taken care of from above, and in advance by the various religions, and these, whatever they may be like, suffice. One might almost believe that half of our thinking takes place unconsciously. Usually we arrive at a conclusion without having clearly thought about the premises which led to it. This is already evident from the fact that sometimes an occurrence whose consequences we can in no way foresee, still less clearly estimate its possible influence on our own affairs, will nonetheless exercise an unmistakable influence on our whole mood, and will change it from cheerful to sad, or from sad to cheerful. This can only be the result of unconscious rumination. It is even more obvious in the following. I have familiarized myself with the factual data of a theoretical or practical problem. I do not think about it again, yet often, a few days later, the answer to the problem will come into my mind entirely of its own accord. The operation which has produced it, however, remains as much a mystery to me as that of an adding machine. What has occurred is, again, unconscious rumination. One might almost venture the physiological hypothesis that conscious thinking takes place on the surface of the brain, and unconscious thinking inside of it. Considering the monotony and consequent insipidity of life, one would find it unendurably tedious, after any considerable length of time, were it not for the continual advance of knowledge and insight, and the acquisition of even better and clearer understanding of all things, which is partly the fruit of experience, partly the result of the changes we ourselves undergo through the different stages of life, by which our point of view is to a certain extent being continually altered, whereby things revealed to us sides we did not yet know. In this way, despite the decline in our mental powers, dies diem docet still holds indefatigably true, and gives life an ever-renewed fascination, in that what is identical continually appears as something new and different. It is quite natural that we should adopt a defensive and negative attitude towards every new opinion concerning something on which we have already an opinion of our own, for it forces its way as an enemy into the previously closed system of our own convictions, shatters the calm of mind we have attained through this system, demands renewed efforts of us, and declares our former efforts to have been in vain. A truth which retrieves us from error is consequently to be compared with a physic, as much for its bitter and repellent taste, as for the fact that it takes effect not at the moment it is imbibed, but only some time afterwards. Thus, if we see the individual obstinately clinging to his errors, with the mass of men it is even worse. Once they have acquired an opinion, experience and instruction can labor for centuries against it, and labor in vain, so that there exist certain universally popular and firmly accredited errors which countless numbers contentedly repeat every day. I have started the list of them which others might like to continue. 1. Suicide is a cowardly act. 2. He who mistrusts others is himself dishonest. 3. Worth and genius are unfeignedly modest. 4. The insane are exceedingly unhappy. 5. Philosophizing can be learned, but not philosophy. The opposite is true. 6. It is easier to write a good tragedy than a good comedy. 7. A little philosophy leads away from God. A lot of it leads back to him. This repeated after Francis Bacon. 8. Knowledge is power. The devil it is! One man can have a great deal of knowledge without its giving him the least power, while another possesses supreme authority, but next to no knowledge. Most of these are repeated parrot fashion without much thought being given to them, and merely because when people first heard them said, they found them very wise-sounding. Intellect is a magnitude of intensity, not a magnitude of extension, which is why, in this respect, one man can confidently take on 10,000, and 1,000 fools do not make one man wise. What the pathetic, commonplace heads with which the world is crammed really lack are two closely related faculties, that of forming judgments and that of producing ideas of their own. But these are lacking to a degree which he who is not one of them cannot easily conceive, so that he cannot easily conceive the dolefulness of their existence. It is this deficiency, however, which explains on one hand the poverty of the scribbling which in all nations passes itself off to its contemporaries as their literature, and on the other, the fate that overtakes true and genuine men who appear among such people. All genuine thought and art is to a certain extent an attempt to put big heads on small people. So it is no wonder the attempt does not always come off. For a writer to afford enjoyment always demands a certain harmony between his way of thinking and that of the reader, and the enjoyment will be the greater the more perfect this harmony is, so that a great mind will fully and completely enjoy only another great mind. It is for this same reason that bad or mediocre writers excite disgust and revulsion in thinking heads, and even conversation with most people has the same effect. One is conscious of the inadequacy and disharmony every step of the way. The life of the plants consists in simple existence, so that their enjoyment of life is purely and absolutely subjective, torpid contentment. With the animals there enters knowledge, but it is still entirely restricted to what serves their own motivation, and indeed their most immediate motivation. That is why they too find complete contentment in simple existence, and why it suffices to fill their entire lives, so that they can pass many hours completely inactive without feeling discontented or impatient, although they are not thinking but merely looking. Only in the very cleverest animals, such as dogs and apes, does the need for activity, and with that boredom, make itself felt, which is why they enjoy playing, and why they amuse themselves by gazing at passers-by, in which respect they are in a class with those human window-gazers who stare at us everywhere, but only when one notices they are students, really arouse our indignation. Only in man has knowledge, that is, the consciousness of other things, in antithesis to mere self-consciousness, reached a high degree, and, with the appearance of the reasoning faculty, risen to thought. As a consequence of this, his life can, besides simple existence, be filled by knowledge as such, which is to a certain extent a second existence outside oneself in other beings and things. With man, too, however, knowledge is mostly restricted to what serves his own motivation, although this now includes motivations less immediate, which, when taken together, are called practical knowledge. On the other hand, he usually has no more free, that is, purposeless knowledge, than is engendered by curiosity and the need for diversion. Yet this kind of knowledge does exist in every man, even if only to this extent. In the meantime, when motivation is quiescent, the life of man is to a large extent filled by simple existence, to which fact the tremendous amount of lounging about that goes on, and the commonness of that kind of sociability which consists chiefly in mere togetherness, without any conversation, or, at the most, very scanty conversation, bear witness. Indeed, most people have, in their hearts even if not consciously, as the supreme guide and maxim of their conduct, the resolve to get by with the least possible expenditure of thought, because to them thinking is hard and burdensome. Consequently, they think only as much as their trade or business makes absolutely necessary, and then again as much as is demanded by their various pastimes, which is what their conversation is just as much as their play. But both must be so ordered that they can be tackled with a minimum of thought. Only where intellect exceeds the measure needed for living does knowledge become more or less an end in itself. It is consequently a quite abnormal event if in some man intellect deserts its natural vocation, that of serving the will by perceiving mere relations between things, in order to occupy itself purely objectively. But it is precisely this which is the origin of art, poetry, and philosophy, which are therefore produced by an organ not originally intended for that purpose. For intellect is fundamentally a hard-working factory hand, whom his demanding master, the will, keeps busy from morn until night. But if this hard-driven serf should once happen to do some of his work voluntarily during his free time, on his own initiative and without any object but the work itself, simply for his own satisfaction and enjoyment, then this is a genuine work of art, indeed, if pushed to an extreme, a work of genius. Such a purely objective employment of the intellect, as well as lying behind all artistic, poetical, and philosophical achievements of the higher kind, also lies behind all purely scientific achievement in general, is already present in purely scientific study and learning, likewise in any free reflection, i.e., reflection not involved with personal interest upon any subject whatever. It is the same thing, indeed, which inspires even mere conversation, if its theme is a purely objective one, i.e., it is not related in any way to the interest, and consequently the will of those taking part in it. Every such purely objective employment of the intellect compares with its subjective employment, i.e., employment in regard to personal interest, however indirectly, as dancing does with walking. For, like dancing, it is the purposeless expenditure of excess energy. On the other hand, the subjective employment of intellect is, of course, the natural one, since intellect arose merely in order to serve will. It is involved not merely in work and the personal drives, but also in all conversation concerning personal affairs and material matters in general, in eating, drinking, other pleasures, in everything pertaining to earning a livelihood, and in utilitarian concerns of every sort. Most men, to be sure, are incapable of any other employment of their intellect, because with them it is merely a tool in service of their will, and is entirely consumed by this service, without any remainder. It is this that makes them so arid, so brutishly earnest, and incapable of objective conversation. Just as the shortness of the bonds joining intellect to will is visible in their face, the impression of narrow-mindedness, which often emerges from it in such a depressing fashion, is, in fact, only the outward sign of the narrow limitation of their total stock of knowledge to the affairs of their own will. One can see here there is just as much intellect as a given will requires for its ends and no more. Hence the vulgarity of their aspect, and hence also the fact that their intellect subsides into inactivity the moment that their will ceases to drive it. They take an objective interest in nothing whatever. Their attention, not to speak of their mind, is engaged by nothing that does not bear some relation, or at least some possible relation, to their own person. Otherwise their interest is not aroused. They are not noticeably stimulated even by wit or humor. They hate rather everything that demands the slightest thought. Coarse buffooneries at most excite them to laughter, and apart from that they are earnest brutes, and all because they are capable of only subjective interest. It is precisely this which makes card-playing the most appropriate amusement for them, card-playing for money, because this does not remain in the sphere of mere knowledge, as stage plays, music, conversation, etc. do, but sets in motion the will itself, the primary element which exists everywhere. For the rest they are, from their first breath to their last, tradesmen, life's born drudges. All their pleasures are sensuous. They have no feeling for any other kind of pleasure. Talk to them about business, but not about anything else. To be sociable with them is to be degraded. On the other hand, conversation between two people who are capable of some sort of purely objective employment of their intellect is a free play of intellectual energy, though the matter be ever so insubstantial and amount to no more than jesting. Such a conversation is in fact like two or more dancing together, while the other sort is like marching side by side, or one behind the other merely in order to arrive somewhere. Now, this tendency towards a free and thus abnormal employment of the intellect, together with the capacity for it, attains in the genius the point at which knowledge becomes the main thing, the aim of the whole of life. His own existence, on the other hand, declines to a subsidiary thing, a mere means, so that the normal relationship is completely reversed. Consequently, the genius lives on the whole more in the rest of the world, by virtue of his knowledge and comprehension of it, than in his own person. The entirely abnormal enhancement of his cognitive powers robs him of the possibility of filling up time with the mere existence and its aims. His mind needs to be constantly and vigorously occupied. He thus lacks that composure in traversing the broad scenes of everyday life, and that easy absorption in them which is granted to ordinary men, so that genius is for the ordinary, practical living appropriate to normal mental powers an ill endowment, and, like every abnormality, an impediment. For with this intensifying of the intellectual powers, intuitive comprehension of the outside world achieves so great a degree of objective clarity, and furnishes so much more than is requisite for serving the will, that such an abundance becomes a downright hindrance to this service, inasmuch as to contemplate given phenomena in themselves, and for their own sake constantly detracts from the contemplation of their connections with the individual will, and with one another, and consequently disturbs and obstructs any clear comprehension of these connections. For the service of the will, an entirely superficial contemplation of things suffices, a contemplation which furnishes no more than their bearing on whatever aims we may have, and whatever may be associated with these aims, and consequently consists of nothing but relationships, with the greatest possible degree of blindness towards everything else. An objective and complete comprehension of the nature of things enfeebles knowledge of this sort, and throws it into disorder. The difference between the genius and the normal intelligence is, to be sure, only a quantitative one, in so far as it is only a difference of degree. One is none the less tempted to regard it as a qualitative one when one considers how normal men, despite their individual diversity, all think along certain common lines, so that they frequently are in unanimous agreement over judgments which are, in fact, false. This goes so far that they have certain basic views which are held in all ages, and continually reiterated, while the great minds of every age have, openly or secretly, opposed these views. A genius is a man in whose head the world as idea has attained a greater degree of clarity and is present more distinctly, and since the weightiest and profoundest insight is furnished not by painstaking observation of what is separate and individual, but by the intensity with which the whole is comprehended, mankind can expect from him the profoundest sort of instruction. Genius can thus also be defined as an exceptionally clear consciousness of things, and therefore also of their antitheses, one's own self. Mankind looks up to one who is thus gifted for disclosures about things, and about its own nature. If you want to earn the gratitude of your own age, you must keep in step with it. But if you do that, you will produce nothing great. If you have something great in view, you must address yourself to posterity. Only then, to be sure, you will probably remain unknown to your contemporaries. You will be like a man compelled to spend his life on a desert island, and there toiling to erect a memorial, so that future seafarers shall know he once existed. Talent works for money and fame. The motive which moves genius to productivity is, on the other hand, less easy to determine. It isn't money, for genius seldom gets any. It isn't fame. Fame is too uncertain, and, more closely considered, of too little worth. Nor is it strictly for its own pleasure, for the great exertion involved almost outweighs the pleasure. It is rather an instinct of a unique sort, by virtue of which the individual possessed of genius is impelled to express what he has seen and felt in enduring works, without being conscious of any further motivation. It takes place, by and large, with the same sort of necessity as a tree brings forth fruit, and demands of the world no more than a soil on which the individual can flourish. More closely considered, it is as if in such an individual the will to live, as the spirit of the human species, had become conscious of having, by a rare accident, attained for a brief span of time to a greater clarity of intellect, and now endeavors to acquire at any rate the results, the products of this clear thought and vision for the whole species, which is indeed also the intrinsic being of the individual, so that their light may continue to illuminate the darkness and stupor of the ordinary human consciousness. It is from this that there arises that instinct which impels genius to labor in solitude to complete its work, without regard for reward, applause, or sympathy, but neglectful rather even of its own well-being, and thinking more of posterity than of the age it lives in, which could only lead it astray, to make its work as a sacred trust and the true fruit of its existence, the property of mankind, laying it down for a posterity better able to appreciate it. This becomes for genius a goal more important than any other, a goal for which it wears the crown of thorns that shall one day blossom into a laurel wreath. Its striving to complete and safeguard its work is just as resolute as that of the insect to safeguard its eggs and provide for the brood it will never live to see. It deposits its eggs where it knows they will one day find life and nourishment, and dies contented